Okay, so the language tester's curse. I want to present the developments in the assessment of spoken language abilities through this metaphor of Pandora's box, or Pandora's jar, as Professor Martinuc reminded me it should be, and the release of unintended consequences into the world when we gain new knowledge and new technologies. And I want you to start by thinking, if you can manage this, think about a situation, and it may be a kind of unfamiliar, and please sort of make a leap of imagination to do this. A situation where we've been through a long period of globalization. There's a lot of concern about mass immigration and movement of peoples between countries, panics around the world, you might say. That there's a loss of certainty, there's a dramatic new set of circumstances, and people are concerned about these, and this is leading to disruption, new political ideas. And at the same time, there are dramatic changes in the world of work. That the kinds of jobs that people have always done are no longer available, and new kinds of jobs are emerging. And the world of education is changing dramatically. At the same time, there's new technology bringing new opportunities. The way that we communicate is being radically changed by new technology. And you'll recognize, of course, I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about the situation at the beginning of the 20th century. And all these new changes were coming in. And the response of educators was to change the way they thought about assessment. So traditionally, assessment had been through examinations. This was the technology of the 19th century, the examination. Examinations were effectively competitions. People who succeeded, and examinations were usually only involved elites. Relatively small numbers of people were examined. And they were competitions. The people who won these competitions would get access to university places or to the best jobs. And somehow they demonstrated their merit, their worthiness for social advancement by succeeding on these examinations. Educational psychologists wanted to revolutionize the way we did assessment. They wanted to get rid of examinations and bring in a new system of testing people. And the difference, I think it's best summed up by the father of comparative education, who was a Romanian American called Isaac Kandel. And he said the old system of examinations, this said what the pupil ought to do, and examinations are used to make him of course, do it. So it was what the pupil ought to do and how to make him do it. So examinations were a way to force people to learn what we wanted them to learn. Testing was supposed to be very different. Testing was about finding out what the pupil can do and allowing him to do it. Find out what the pupil can do and allow him to do it. Can do, that sounds familiar. So that was the intention at the beginning of the 20th century. We would have a new form of assessment. One of the unintended side effects of this new form of assessment was to have a negative impact on how we assessed speaking. The assessment of speaking was not a problem for examinations. Only a small number of people entered for examinations, and examinations by tradition were done orally by the teacher in the classroom or by some expert who would talk to the candidate and decide whether or not they were worthy of furtherment. Testing wanted to be more scientific, and testing speaking raised practical difficulties. The way around those practical difficulties was technological. Let's look at how that might work. So starting with a way of thinking about speaking that involved language. So speaking was about how people used language to communicate through speech. And in the 20th century, as the testing of speaking developed, we tended to think of speaking through a transmission model. So the speaker would have a mental representation of something they wanted to communicate. They would use the channel of speech, and they would transmit their ideas to a hearer. And to do that, they had to encode what they wanted to say, and the hearer had to be able to decode the message from the speaker. Unfortunately, of course, there is always noise. So in the engineering metaphor that was used, this is interference on the line, if you like. So there are always things happening that interfere with the message that the speaker wants to communicate to the listener. So the mental representation that the listener ends up with is not identical to the mental representation that the speaker intended to communicate. We can learn about that difference through a feedback loop. So if the hearer then communicates back what it was that they received, then we can see how far the mental representation has been degraded by this noise interference. And this is a model that we still find represented in a lot of tests that are used today. In fact, it may be that it's increasingly represented in some of the tests that are used today. So if we want to know about somebody's ability to speak, we can give them tasks to do, like get them to read a sentence aloud, or to repeat back a sentence that we've given them. Or we could ask them to reorder elements in that they've been provided with orally. And so in this example, reordering "in the countryside soon to visit my grandmother I would really like." And if they can do that successfully, it suggests that they have the sorts of knowledge that we're interested in and are able to communicate through speech. Or we give them pictures to describe or to narrate about. And when we're scoring this kind of performance, we're going to be interested in these sorts of features. So how was their pronunciation? Did they arrange the elements in the way that we intended them to? And were they able to use the grammar, the vocabulary, in appropriate ways? So the assessment of speaking using this kind of model is going to focus on the encoding process that the speaker goes through. And we'll focus on their use of the vocabulary, the grammar, and phonology. And that adds up to speaking ability. And this is very often the sort of testing construct that is used, particularly in tests that rely heavily on delivery through computer. Of course, all of this was challenged heavily in the 1970s by the growth in sociolinguistic approaches to spoken language. It was recognized that speaking is not simply a matter of having the grammar, the vocabulary, and the phonology. It also involved other things. So people started to develop new constructs to represent speaking ability. And cognitively, we started to focus on the sorts of processes that people need to go through in order to shape what they're going to say. So an element of planning and organizing speech. What is the message that we're going to communicate? How do we turn that into this, the linguistic form that we want to communicate? So we focused on processes in the mind of the speaker, in how they plan and organize what they're going to say, how they encode what they're going to say, and the spoken output, placed in a context. So what is the social context in which we are speaking? Who are we speaking to? And what kind of event are we involved in? Is this a transaction, or is this more a social interaction? So the kinds of task that could realize this is an example from the TOEIC speaking test, would involve more concern for topic, more concern for maintaining some kind of topic and interaction, and giving people opportunities to expand on what they were saying. It's not simply a matter of repeating back elements. Here it's a matter of planning and delivering a message. So thinking about this kind of task, we can see that here test taker is being given some kind of information to work from. There's not a great deal of interaction happening, but it is involving a developing communication that has more than one step to it. So here there are 3 questions with follow-up elements where the test taker has to rely on some source of information. They have to plan how they're going to present that information to the hearer. And therefore, we can introduce elements like the relevance of the response. Is what the test taker says relevant to what the supposed hearer needs to understand about the message? So here we still have all of those same elements of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, but we have the added element of task relevance. But this is still focused on spoken output, the mental representation. How well is that represented in what is produced by the speaker? It's really during the so we have these elements with the strategic competence added into, and the pragmatic competence added into the elements that were of interest before. Taking that a step further, the communicative revolution that happened sort of during the 1980s introduced the idea that actually we'd be interested not only in how well a speaker can produce language, but in how well they might be able to interact with others as they did so. So here we were interested not just in the speaker, but in the speaker/listener. So we had the listening aspect added to the speaking aspect. Can somebody respond in real time to the person they're interacting with and do so in appropriate ways that encourage the interaction and result in successful communication and successful social outcomes? So it's not only a question of what the mental representation was that the speaker wanted to communicate, but also the mental representation that they arrive at as a result of the communication. And that adds up to an interactional competence. It's not just the speaker producing language, but it's interacting with others to achieve some kind of success. So this brings in new elements, and here I'm drawing very heavily on Evelina Galacci and Linda Taylor's paper on interactional competence in Language Assessment Quarterly, which they present as a beautiful tree diagram. I've done it slightly differently here. With roots, yeah. These are the roots. So the roots come from the context of the situation. So what is the situation in which the interactants find themselves? The speech events, so are they involved in buying and selling something in a store? Are they involved in a chat in a bar? What is the speech event that they're engaged in? And the speech acts, the language functions, what we in the Common European Framework might call communicative language activities. What is it that they're doing? What is it they're achieving as they communicate? And these are the branches of the tree, the ways in which people manage and engage in interaction. So interactive listening, paying attention to what the other person in the conversation is doing. Managing turns, so recognizing when it's appropriate for you to speak, when it's appropriate to bring the other person in to speak, and how we go about doing that. Managing the topic, indicating where we're changing the topic, how we show that we're closing off one topic and moving to another. Non-verbal behavior, so how far can we use our facial expression, how far can we use gesture to support what it is that we are saying and how the interaction is going. And the repair of breakdowns, so what happens when we recognize that communication is failing, when we're not achieving our communicative goals, how can we fix those problems? All of these elements come into the assessment of speaking. So as an example of this, I'll use a task that was developed by a student of mine working with people in call centers. And he went out and he looked at how people have to perform when they're in the call center. How do they deal with the calls that come in? What sorts of language do they have to produce? How do they have to respond to the callers? Can they be appropriately polite? So he identified the kinds of speech acts that would be involved in taking a call in a call center, dealing with the sorts of issues that the call center operatives were supposed to be able to manage. And he used that to develop tasks for people who wanted to work in these call centers, to replace the interviews that had been used previously. So here are the task instructions for the test taker. You can see that it gives the test taker a very clear role. They know who they are in the interaction and what it is that they're supposed to achieve through interacting with the customer, the client. He also threw in a few unexpected elements into the conversation. So when the caller called in, it turned out that the caller's name was O'Sullivan, which he assumed that none of the, I can't imagine why he chose the name O'Sullivan, but he assumed that this would be a name that would be unfamiliar to the people who are working or the intending to work in the call center. So they would have to ask the caller to spell the name for them to fix that element. So they were given the instruction they had to answer the call, greet the customer, complete the form, and there would always be something unexpected happening in the interaction that they would have to deal with. We think about how to judge this kind of performance. We maybe need to look at how the rating scales reflect these elements of interactional competence in addition to speaking ability. So here are a couple of examples from, actually developed by my colleague John Field with Trinity College London, looking at how to build in some elements of interactive competence, interactional competence into rating scales. So judgments of how communicatively effective the participants were in the interaction, and how far they interactively listened to their conversational partner. Taking this a step further, again, colleagues at the University of Bedfordshire worked on an interactional competence checklist, the IC checklist, for use with Cambridge exams to provide feedback to participants in those exams. So in addition to scoring using the traditional rating scales, they use this to judge the extent to which the participants in the exam events were demonstrating interactional competence. And this was a basis for feedback to participants on how effectively they'd made use of these features. And each of the listed 9 elements has sub-features within it, and presented as a simple checklist. So it's yes, you did this, no, you didn't, to provide the test takers with that feedback. So this is the element of Pandora's box. And it's turned back into a box here, I do apologize. We can ask ourselves, this is Tim McNamara's model of what's involved in a score from a speaking test. So the score results not just from how effectively that test taker has turned their mental representation into and encoded successfully their mental representation into speech, but also from the other candidate they may be interacting with, the task that they've been asked to do, and the rater. And each of these elements affects the kind of score that comes out. So the score is not simply a reflection of the speaker's speaking ability, but also a reflection of all of these other elements in the speaking test event. So to what extent is this the score representing the test taker's ability? To what extent is it a score representing everything else that's happened? So by opening Pandora's box, we've released, rather unexpectedly, an elephant into the room. So in the test-taking event, that elephant of all of these other elements that are involved in test-taking weighs down on the kind of interpretation that we can make of the scores we receive. So this is summed up by Micheline Chalhoub-Deville and Craig Deville in their 2005 paper, where they say if we view language as co-constructed by these different people involved in the speaking event, how can we disentangle that individual score from everything else that's going on? So how have speaking test developers responded? Well, they've tried to cage that elephant and keep it penned in the corner of the room where it can't do too much damage, either by controlling the task and how it's scored, so by getting the test taker to speak to a robot or to a scripted examiner who will deliver exactly the same experience to every test taker, or by reducing their control but still trying to influence what happens in the test-taking event. So rather as those later test tasks have done, allowing a slightly less controlled interaction to happen, but judging the contribution of the participants and trying to exclude other influences on what has been going on. So if we've opened Pandora's box, we've also tried to contain its impact by managing how far those other elements impact on the performance of the individual test taker. But this actually, I think, ignores the elephant. Maybe that elephant is bigger than we thought it was. Maybe we can't quite so easily contain it in that cage and put it into the corner of the room. And I think that brings us to the possibilities and the dangers of new ways of thinking about language assessment. So if we think about our old model of communication, to my mind, that resembles our current models of validation. So we have this idea that we are judging interactional competence. We do that by eliciting a performance from a test taker, a process of scoring that test taker using the technology of the early 20th century, the graphic rating scales that were developed in the 1920s, and interpreting those scores as meaning something for the people who are going to use the results of our tests. And this is affected, the noise in this transmission model comes from error. And error, the things we're trying to exclude from our measurement, come from the task and the interlocutors and from rating scales and raters. And we hope that the image that the user of test results ends up with resembles what we think it is that we're testing. And we hope that the image that the user has represents the abilities that we think it is that we've tested. But this, I think you'll agree, closely resembles the old transmission model of communication that speaking tests were once based on. And I think we need to reconsider that model of validation. So at the moment, we focus on the candidate and their abilities. But if we think it sociolinguistically, the candidate is only one element in the interaction. It's not just that they're speaking to another test taker or they're doing it with an examiner, but they're involved in a whole network of interactions. So by focusing just on the candidate, we are ignoring the enormous element in the room, which is that it's a network that brings successful communication. And if we think about it in the way that applied linguistics are beginning to think more, in terms of ecological systems, then what makes for successful communication involves not only the individual test taker and the microsystem of the people they're interacting with, and the nature of those interactions, the mesosystem, the exosystem of all the other people that interact with all the people we're interacting with, and the macro system of wider society within which that is happening, and the particular time frame within which all of this is going on, then focusing just on that individual test taker is evidently a mistake. So can we turn our attention away from the individual test taker and use our assessment to focus on how that test taker operates within wider networks? And instead of asking, is this test taker able to operate within wider frameworks? Can they use Welsh if they're going to work in a Welsh-speaking workplace? Instead, to turn our attention to the policy level and the networks where that is operating and ask, how is it that we can make this person, what would need to happen for this person to operate successfully in a Welsh-speaking environment? What would need to change in Wales for us to get to 1 million people using Welsh regularly in their everyday life? So new technology obviously offers us some affordances for arriving at that kind of solution. So we can use the new opportunities provided by large language models, etc., to think about how we can actually change the environment in which people work. So rather than focusing on the individual test-taking candidate, we can think about what needs to change in their environment around that person in order for them to operate successfully in a situation where they need to acquire a different language. And how can technology help them? How can other affordances help them to operate successfully in other ways? So, I've been told to stop. I'm sure you may have some questions. The elephant is ready, but the elephant wants his lunch. So let's break there. Thank you very much.